Sam was a curious boy who lived in a small village by the brook. The village was a quiet place where everyone knew each other. The houses were simple and surrounded by fields of golden wheat. The sound of the stream running over stones was always in the air, and the people here were friendly. They worked together, helped one another, and shared everything they had. Sam was 10 years old, with dark brown hair and bright blue eyes. He loved exploring the woods near the village and spending time by the brook. His family lived in a little house on the edge of the village, where they grew vegetables and kept chickens. Sam's mother, Mrs. Green, was kind and loving, always with a smile on her face. His father, Mr. Green, was strong and worked hard, taking care of the crops and fixing things around the house. One of the most interesting people in the village was Mrs. Willoughby. She was an old woman who lived alone in a crooked house on the far side of the village, near the edge of the forest. Her house was full of strange things: herbs hanging from the ceiling, jars of odd liquids, and shelves full of trinkets. The villagers called her a witch, but Sam never thought she was anything to be afraid of. In fact, he liked visiting her. Mrs. Willoughby was kind to him. When Sam was sad, she would always say, "You must remember to look at the stars, Sam. They have wisdom." She would smile and offer him little treats, or sometimes she would give him a shiny rock or a small jar of honey. Sam didn't care what the others said about her. She was good to him, and that was enough. One autumn evening, the sky turned dark and heavy. The wind began to howl, and clouds covered the sun. The villagers felt uneasy as the storm grew stronger. Sam's mother hurried inside, closing the windows and locking the doors. The storm was fierce, with lightning flashing and thunder roaring. The sound of the wind was so loud that it almost seemed as though it would tear the houses apart. The next morning, when Sam woke up, he saw the damage the storm had caused. The roof of Mr. Black's house had been torn off, and the trees in the field were uprooted. Some of the village's farm animals had disappeared, and the crops were ruined. The villagers were upset. They gathered in the square to discuss what had happened. As they spoke, they started to point fingers. "It's the witch, Mrs. Willoughby," Mr. Gray said. "I've heard she controls the weather." The others nodded and murmured in agreement. Sam didn't believe this. He knew Mrs. Willoughby. She wasn't a witch who could cause storms. But the villagers didn't listen to him. They were afraid, and fear often made people say things that weren't true. The mood in the village became tense. The villagers started to talk more and more about Mrs. Willoughby. They decided they needed to go to her house and ask her to leave the village. Some of them even said that she should be locked away. Sam overheard his parents talking late at night. "We don't want to anger the others," his father said. we may have to do what they ask. Sam felt a wave of sadness. He didn't want to see Mrs. Willoughby hurt. He knew she was kind, and she had always helped him when he needed it. But he also understood that his parents didn't want trouble. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sam made up his mind. He had to warn Mrs. Willoughby. He sneaked out of his house and ran through the fields, his heart racing. When he reached Mrs. Willoughby's house, he knocked softly on the door. "Who is it?" came her voice from inside. "It's me, Sam," he said. "You have to leave. The villagers, they want to hurt you. They think you caused the storm." There was silence for a moment, and then the door creaked open. Mrs. Willoughby stood there, her face soft with concern. She was wearing an old, worn dress, and her long gray hair hung loosely around her shoulders. "Come inside, Sam," she said gently. "You're safe here." Inside Mrs. Willoughby's home, it was warm and smelled of dried herbs. There was a fire crackling in the hearth, and Sam felt a little better. Mrs. Willoughby motioned for him to sit at the small table. She brought out a cup of tea, which smelled like flowers, and handed it to him. Sam took a sip and looked up at her. "Please, tell me what's happening. Why do they say these things about you?" Mrs. Willoughby sat down across from him. Her eyes were kind but sad. "You've heard the stories, haven't you, Sam?" she said quietly. "The ones about witches, about women who can do things others don't understand." Sam nodded. "I am not a witch, Sam," Mrs. Willoughby said. "But my great-grandmother was. She was a healer. She used herbs and potions to help people when they were sick, and she protected the village from danger. The wolves were fierce in those days, and the weather could be harsh. She kept the village safe." "Is that what you do?" Sam asked. "Yes," she replied. "I've inherited her knowledge. I help when I can, when animals are sick or crops are failing. But I never wanted to scare anyone. I only wanted to help." Sam thought for a moment. "Then the storm. It wasn't you?" "No, Sam," Mrs. Willoughby said. "The storm was nature. Sometimes the weather is just like that. It's not magic." Sam felt a mix of relief and sadness. He didn't want Mrs. Willoughby to leave the village, but he knew that the villagers would never believe her. The next day, Mrs. Willoughby packed her things. She didn't want to cause more trouble, so she decided it was best to leave. Sam watched her from a distance, feeling a heavy weight in his heart. He couldn't understand why people were so quick to judge her. Before she left, Mrs. Willoughby handed him a small locket. "This is for you, Sam," she said. "It's a symbol of our friendship. Inside, you'll find something special." Sam opened the locket carefully. Inside, there was a tiny crystal that glowed softly. There was a note with it that read, "Help others as I have helped you." Sam knew that he would never forget Mrs. Willoughby. She had taught him something important, that kindness and compassion were the true magic in the world. As the days passed, Sam kept the locket close. He used the lessons Mrs. Willoughby had taught him to help those around him. And slowly, the villagers began to see that maybe they had been wrong to judge her. They started to remember the good things she had done and realized that fear had made them forget. As the days passed, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that he had let Mrs. Willoughby down. He missed her, and he felt guilty for not being able to stop the villagers from driving her away. The locket she had given him stayed close to his heart. Its small, glowing crystal, a reminder of the kindness she had shown him. One afternoon, Sam was sitting by the brook, looking at the water flow over the rocks, deep in thought. He thought about all the good things Mrs. Willoughby had done for him, how she had given him advice when he was sad, how she had shared her knowledge of herbs and plants, and how, when his dog had fallen ill, it was Mrs. Willoughby's herbs that had healed him. He realized something. If he could help people the way Mrs. Willoughby had helped him, maybe he could make things better. The village had been so quick to judge, but perhaps, over time, they would see that kindness was what the world needed most. Sam stood up, his heart filled with purpose. He would learn from Mrs. Willoughby, and he would share what he knew with the villagers. But he would do it slowly. First, he would start with small things, helping his neighbors, healing the sick animals, and taking care of the crops. He hoped that one day the villagers would understand the true magic of kindness. One chilly morning, Sam was walking through the village when he saw Mr. Johnson's calf lying in the field. It looked weak, barely able to stand. The other cows were grazing nearby, but the little calf seemed too tired to move. Sam rushed over to the calf, his heart racing. He remembered the herbs that Mrs. Willoughby had taught him about, herbal remedies that could heal animals. He knelt beside the calf, stroking its fur gently. It made a soft noise, its eyes drooping in pain. "Don't worry," Sam whispered. "I'll help you." Sam ran back to his house and grabbed some of the herbs he had collected from the woods. He crushed them up and mixed them with some water, just like Mrs. Willoughby had shown him. Then he brought the mixture to the calf, carefully feeding it to the animal. Over the next few days, Sam continued to visit the calf. He made sure it had plenty of food and water, and he kept giving it the herbal mixture. Slowly, the calf began to recover. By the end of the week, it was strong enough to stand and walk again. When Sam went to tell Mr. Johnson the good news, the farmer was surprised. "You did this?" he asked. "I thought it was lost for sure." "I just used some herbs," Sam said modestly. "Mrs. Willoughby taught me a few things." Mr. Johnson looked at Sam carefully. "Well, I'm glad to see you're helping. You've done a good thing." Sam smiled. It was a small victory, but it made him feel proud. Maybe, just maybe, the villagers would start to trust him the way they had trusted Mrs. Willoughby. As the weeks went by, Sam's actions began to make a difference. He helped with the sick animals, shared his knowledge of herbs with the farmers, and even helped mend fences and repair roofs. The villagers started to notice his efforts, and slowly the whispers of distrust began to fade. One evening, Sam was helping Mrs. Green bake bread when there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Jenkins, the village's eldest resident. "Sam, my boy," she said with a smile, "I've heard the good things you've been doing. You've got your mother's heart, I can tell." Sam blushed a little, but he was pleased. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins." Mrs. Jenkins nodded. "I want to show you something. Come with me." She led Sam to her house, a small cottage on the edge of the village. Inside, she showed him a shelf filled with old books. "These were my grandmother's," she said, dusting off a thick book. "She used to be a healer, just like Mrs. Willoughby." Sam's eyes widened. "You mean your grandmother helped people with herbs, too?" Mrs. Jenkins smiled softly. "Yes, and so did many others in the village. But people forget the old ways. We all used to work together, help each other. Mrs. Willoughby's great-grandmother helped protect this village, and so did mine. We didn't need magic, Sam. Just love and kindness." Sam felt a rush of warmth in his chest. This was what he had been trying to show the villagers, that the real magic came from helping one another, from caring. He realized that he wasn't alone in wanting to help the village heal. Mrs. Jenkins and many others remembered the old ways too. That night, Sam couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, thinking about what Mrs. Jenkins had said. He knew that he had to keep helping. It wasn't just about Mrs. Willoughby anymore. It was about bringing the village together, helping each other, and showing that kindness could heal the hardest hearts. Months passed, and the village slowly returned to its normal rhythm. People were no longer afraid of the storms, and the villagers had stopped whispering about witches. Life was peaceful again, but Sam couldn't help but miss Mrs. Willoughby. One day, as Sam was walking through the village, he saw something that made his heart leap. At the edge of the village stood Mrs. Willoughby, standing just outside the woods. She was carrying a small bag and looking at the village with a wistful expression. Sam ran up to her, his eyes wide with surprise and joy. "Mrs. Willoughby," he cried, "you're back." She turned to him and smiled warmly. "I had to come back, Sam. The village needs people like you." "I've been trying to help," Sam said, his voice full of excitement. "I've learned so much from you. I've helped with the animals, and I've shown people how to use the herbs, and they're starting to trust me." Mrs. Willoughby nodded, her eyes twinkling. "I knew you had it in you, Sam. You're more than ready. The village has changed, and you're a big part of that change." Sam felt a wave of happiness. Mrs. Willoughby was back, and the village was healing. Together, they would continue to help the people and animals of Willowbrook. As time went on, Sam and Mrs. Willoughby worked together, teaching the villagers how to care for their land, their animals, and each other. Slowly, the village became a place where kindness, not fear, was the way to solve problems. One day, as Sam sat with Mrs. Willoughby in her house, he looked at the glowing crystal inside the locket she had given him. It had never lost its light, and Sam realized that it wasn't the crystal that was magical. It was the love and kindness that had been passed down through the generations. "Thank you, Mrs. Willoughby," Sam said quietly. "You taught me something that no one else could." She smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "It was always within you, Sam. You just had to remember it." And so Willowbrook flourished. The villagers worked together, helped each other, and shared the wisdom of the old ways. They had learned that true magic wasn't in spells or potions, but in the simple act of helping others. And Sam, with his kind heart and strong spirit, would continue to spread that magic for the rest of his life. The end.